coming. There should be some printed out forms of the slides at the back. Islandhood and clinics in language development. This talk didn't, well, let's put it this way. The initial findings that we're reporting here did not really relate to islands as such, but more to clinics and development of clinics in young children. Part of both our research team's involvement in Costa Action A33, which dealt with milestones in language development at age 5. And one small aspect there was looking at acquisition of clinics and production of clinics by 5-year-olds across Europe's languages, with the hope of finding, not surprisingly, that 5-year-old children can produce clinics. What puts João and me in the same boat, however, is that European Portuguese and Cypriot Greek, our respective languages, differ from the other languages in interesting ways and in substantial ways, possibly also with respect to islandhood in early child language. And that's the aspect of the findings that we're going to report here. So the idea of this talk is that we're going to get to islandhood in a more roundabout way, in that I first lay out some very basics about the acquisition of clinics, looking at very general properties of Cypriot Greek and European Portuguese for clinic contexts. Then I will present the elicitation tool that we used for clinics, which happened to have an island built into it, and report on the findings for Cypriot Greek. And up to that point, you may wonder what's the relevance to islands. Well, then João will report the same tool's results for European Portuguese, expand with different experiments they carried out in addition, and finally come full circle to a more island-oriented discussion of the findings from European Portuguese, which he is then going to synthesize with respect to the talk for the larger aspect of islandhood in early child language. Now, research on the acquisition of clinics in typical as well as atypical language development so far focuses to a very large extent on clinic production in simple declarative clauses, ever since Schaeffer's 1997 talk, of which we use a version here for the elicitation tool and lots of other work. Now, although there's typically some error analysis being done on what children do wrongly or differently from adults, the nature of omission in particular and the differential behavior of omission in contexts and where it is favored even in adult language is overlooked, and that's going to be very relevant for European Portuguese. And the same overlooking takes place, concerns the placement of clinics in mixed clinic placement languages, and that's something that Cypriot Greek and European Portuguese have in common. That is, they are both enclitic languages that allow proclisis in certain contexts. So when we look at clinic production by young children, we also want to know, we not only want to know whether they produce, but also where they place them, how they place them. And in that respect, the results that we report here today will also be revealing. So we will report on the relevance of investigating the development of clinic production in island context, presenting the results from the Costa action, basically on the same tool for European Portuguese and Cypriot Greek. And we believe that these are much more in line with the claim that island effects arise from grammatical constraints rather than from limited processing resources in terms of working memory and additional load. In that respect, supporting much of the current work going on in this debate, although I believe that after lunch we will hear the other perspective as well. Clinics in European Portuguese, look at object clinics. We focus on accusative clinics, although European Portuguese also has dative clinics. Some examples are given here. Concerning accusative clinics, Portuguese distinguishes inflection for masculine, feminine, gender, as well as singular and plural number. And likewise, in Cypriot Greek, we have accusative clinics as well as genitive clinics. And here, Cypriot Greek differs from Standard Modern Greek in that it allows that certain verbs subcategorized for non-accusative objects. Oh, the alignment is a bit off. And here we also find gender, masculine, feminine, and neuter, as well as number distinctions. European Portuguese is generally an enclitic language. That means that proclisis is triggered in specific syntactic environments, and in that sense, it differs from most other Romance languages, but is similar to geographically and linguistically closely related Galician and Asturian. The proclisis-enclisis variation is by and large syntactically conditioned, taking place under negation with a filled complementizer, affective operators, qualified subjects, certain adverbs, and in WH questions. It's also affected by prosodic factors, and interestingly, it's subject to variation. There seems to be a tendency in young children, especially, to overuse enclisis in earlier stages. Likewise, Cypriot Greek is an enclitic language. That is, proclisis is triggered in specific syntactic environments. In this sense, Cypriot differs from Standard Modern Greek, as well as most Modern Greek dialects, but it is similar to the geographically and linguistically closely related dialect or Greek dialect of the Dodecanese, spoken in Rhodes, for example. With a big difference, of course, that Cyprus is its own republic, its own country, hence has an army and a navy, whereas the army and the navy in Rhodes comes from Athens. Likewise, the proclisis-enclisis variation is largely syntactically conditioned, typically under negation, the subjunctive, with certain qualifiers, and in WH questions we get proclisis. There has been some suggestions about prosodic factors involved as well, and there have been some reports about the overuse of enclisis in early acquisition, but our findings do not really correlate with the enclitic overuse hypothesis as such, but we're currently investigating this more systematically as well. Now, in islands, interestingly, European Portuguese requires proclisis obligatorily. Sorry about the Mac Windows mismatch with the alignment. On my computer, it looked very nice. So here we have an example of the butterfly can't fly because the girl caught it. So here we have a because sentence, and you see the bold-faced, it is bold-faced proclitic placement in Portuguese. In Cypriot Greek, islands apparently don't trigger, or they don't trigger systematically and obligatorily proclisis, so it's fine to have enclisis in this context. The or ... question mark is something we might get back later to. Oh boy. Yes, okay, good. I thought the whole slide was gone. The Cost Action A33 was a 4-year research network across Europe, including roughly 100 people altogether. Over 25 countries were involved. We looked at syntactic, semantic, pragmatic development. The target group of our investigation were 5-year-old children, and we developed the same tools that were administered in all of these languages. One of these tools concerns clitic production, and that tool was administered to both Cypriot Greek and European Portuguese as well. Concerning acquisition of clitics in Cypriot Greek, there is very little work on this. Through this cost action, we are looking more into different age groups as well. So by now, my research team has pretty solid data from ages 2 to 6, so beyond the original target age of 5. And given the linguistically interesting setting of Cyprus, we have a lot of different Greek speakers to count on. So the largest population are, of course, Greek Cypriot children, who are presumably bilectal in the sense that their native language is Cypriot Greek, a non-standardized variety of modern Greek, but Standard Modern Greek is the language of instruction, official language of the school, of the country. But there are lots of binational children where one parent comes from Greece, the other one from Cyprus, who do have a slightly different linguistic upbringing. And of course, lots of monolingual Greek children too, where both parents are from Greece and have recently, or more or less recently, relocated to Cyprus. So these are children that have grown up in Greece for some point and up to some point and then moved to Cyprus. On the linguistic side, it's a little bit complex, and maybe we'll get back to that later. In terms of our participants, within the cost action, we targeted 25-year-olds But because of the interesting results that we got, we extended our children, and now we have more than 160 children tested at different ages. By now, from across the island. They're all typically developing children. Initially, we only had 8 controlled adults, but we're working on getting more as well. If you look at the participants here, the main target group were the 5-year-olds, of whom we have 50 for the results relevant for today. You see the mean ages and more or less some balance in terms of gender. The tool that we developed based on Sheffer 97 was a production tool for third-person singular accusative clitics in an island context. The reason why we chose an island context is that European Portuguese is a language that likes to drop lots of object clitics, so we thought we were on the safe side by putting it into an island, because in islands, European Portuguese does not allow omission, or so it seemed to us. We will get back to that later too. The tool itself contained 2 warm-up sentences to make sure that the child understands the task. We had 12 target structures, and for fillers, they were in a randomized order, and the relevant types of the 12 target structures were all of this sort, so the child saw this picture, and the experimenter gave an explanation. Look, this is a picture about combing. Mommy is combing the girl, and the girl is beautiful. Why is the girl beautiful? And the experimenter carried on. The girl is beautiful because mommy, so this is a sentence completion task where the child then had to fill in only verb plus clitic. So in this case, combs her. Now, this little aside, having 12 of these structures, children are not dumb, so they pick up pretty quickly, and they were eager to participate. They liked the tool. There were colored pictures, which was very helpful, but they tended often to butt in. So it's not the case that we got a very clean elicitation where the experimenter went all the way up to the ... So sometimes the child already started before the because clause with the subject. Sometimes the child already butted in and helped out with the entire because clause. There's some variation. But all of the children certainly produced the verb plus clitic, and that was the original idea was, as a production tool, we want to see whether they produce clitics, and then as a side effect, to see what the placement was. So what we saw here is, going back, no. What you can see in the Cypriot Greek version, the clitic tin should be enclitic, that is follow the verb, as in the structure here. That's the Cypriot version. In Standard Modern Greek, it would be proclisis. Standard Modern Greek doesn't have enclisis in this context. What we found in the original, again, now go to the 5-year-olds. The 5-year-olds gave us 94% production, so non-surprisingly, they produced clitics. But they only gave us 68% of target verb clitic placement. And in fact, if you look at this line, if you look at this table, you see that from age 2 already, the percentage of production was very high. So early production is possible. Clitics are produced by young children as well. But what we see in the rightmost column is that the target percentage for placement systematically went down. We go from 90 to 89 to 88%, or very, very high, verb clitics or enclisis. And then we jumped to 68% and then to 47% with, at that time, the 8 adult controls, giving us 100% verb plus clitic enclisis. So it looks like the older the children, the fewer Cypriot Greek target-like clitics they produce. This is the same in a slightly different representation. So the 2 to 5-year-olds, the 2, 3, and 4-year-olds performed as expected with a high percentage of post-verbal production. The 5 and 6-year-olds are believed to be affected possibly by the schooling factor, that is around age 5, so in preschool. The language of instruction is Standard Modern Greek, which the children need to know in order to then start reading and writing later on. So what I call the socio-syntax of development hypothesis is that the bilectal, I call them bi-X, so let's say bilectal speakers of Cypriot Greek, who have Cypriot Greek as a native language and Standard Modern Greek as a second dialect, are affected by the schooling. What we then did is we regrouped the children, not in terms of their chronological age, but in terms of their schooling. That is, where they went to nursery, what we call the pre-primary, and grade 1 primary school. and you see the mean ages in each of these. And what we see here is that, again, production is very high, but placement systematically goes down. However, the difference between the two groupings would be that the curve is much smoother and gradual in the schooling age ordering. Now, in terms of the discussion of this, what we see under both types of analysis, the younger the children, the stronger the preference for Cypriot Greek target post-verbal enclisis. The schooling effect seems to set on with schooling. And there arguably, but that's not the topic of this talk, matter or sociolinguistic factors that may influence the children to use the more proper standard Greek variety. We also carried out a second Clitic study where we looked with the same tool at not only at bilingual Greek Cypriot children, but also at the binational and monolingual Greek children. And I'm not going to present the data because they don't really pertain much to islands, but the discussion part is very similar in that the younger children produce more Cypriot Greek enclisis, whereas both the binational and the monolingual Greek speakers show a much stronger preference for the standard modern Greek pre-verbal Clitic placement. Now, as a more general discussion about the Clitics in Ireland's tool for Cypriot Greeks, what we find that the monolingual bilectal Cypriot Greek, standard modern Greek speaking children produce Clitics from early on, very early on, that's fine, so from age 2 they produce Clitics. There seems to be a curve of preference from Enclitic for the younger children to Proclitic to the older children, where we assume that Enclisis correlates to Cypriot Greek grammar, Proclisis to the standard modern Greek grammar, and that this curve appears to correlate with schooling, which is done in standard modern Greek. What we take, and that's the relevance for this conference, what we take out most relevant here is that islandhood as such is not the source for a problem for children acquiring Clitics in Cypriot Greek. To the extent that there is a problem, it relates to pre versus post-verbal Clitic placement. So while supposedly an enclisis environment conferred by our adult controls and by all my Cypriot Greek-speaking students who carried out the testing, school-age children frequently produce proclisis, while the younger ones never do. But what I mean by supposedly is that at that time, this time we don't have enough adult controls yet, but we also have some interesting issues of what we call the reversal children. So for example, just last week, one of my PhD students went in to test, to apply this tool, administer this tool to a 7-year-old, 6-year-old, and she produced only proclisis in these contexts. And then my student did some other tests as well, and then left the house, and a couple of hours went back and gave her the same pictures in a different order, but this time made the context much smaller, not looking for islands, but basically looking at this picture, for example, what is the mother doing to the girl? And so without any island context, just to get a Clitic production out there. And in that case, the same child that 2-3 hours before gave 100% enclisis now produced 100% proclisis. So there may be something going on with the tool itself.
Okay, now turning to Portuguese. If you want to do Clitic production in Portuguese in children, you have to bear in mind that Portuguese is a null-object language, so if a child does not produce a Clitic, you never know whether the child is actually omitting a Clitic or doing a target null-object. For that, just to give you some context of what the null-object grammar is like, first it appears to be a free option. So you can freely alternate Clitics and null objects in similar pragmatic contexts if you are dealing with root sentences. It targets not only accusative context, and if you have a reflexive or a first or second person context, then the null object is ruled out. For the context of this conference, what is relevant is to know that null objects are not possible in syntactic islands. So you have an example here. If you ask, what about ze? If it is a root context like in B, you can say, I didn't see him, or you can say, I didn't see. But if you embed this in an island and you have here the because clause, then the Clitic is obligatory and you cannot have a null object. So in a set of studies with Maria Lobo and Carolina Silva, starting a couple of years ago, we wanted to test clitic production in the acquisition, but we also wanted to be cautious and be sure that we would be looking at really clitic omission if it existed, not at target null objects. Kleanthe already gave some of the background for this, so we know that in some language children omit clitics in their earliest production. This is not universal. For some reason there is more omission in some language than others. This is subject to a big debate, and typically this affects third-person accusative clitics and not clitics in general. So to know what kids are doing when we test and when we assess clitic production in Portuguese, we tested clitic production in two different environments. One in root context, and then we get ambiguous results. We don't exactly know what they are doing. And we also tested clitics. We elicited the production of clitics in islands, and this was a bit the basis for the test that Kleanthe has presented that we developed in this Costa A33 project. The method for the results I'm reporting on here is basically the same but without the image. So we had small toys and the whole story, and now we are doing it with pictures because it's much quicker. So we have cases like this: Pooh has a towel, tiger is wet, look at what Pooh is doing to the tiger, and then he's drying him. And then the puppet says, I know, Pooh washed tiger, and then the experimenter says, no, tell the puppet what Pooh did to tiger. And then the expectation, so you see the purpose of this to make tiger very highly accessible so that the child doesn't need to use the DP again. So the expectation is that either the child will use a clitic or a null object because this is a root context. And then we did the same for islands in a very similar setup to what Kleanthe has just presented. This is our informants for this study. By now we have more. So we tested 3, 4, 5, and 6-year-old children in a total of 73 children and 15 adults. But as I said, we have more data. This is the result for root context. What is relevant here, so there's a bunch of data here, but what's relevant here is for you to see that there's a growth in clitic production from 3 to 6, and that kids do a lot of null forms, more than adults. And if you just look at these results, it seems that European Portuguese is not a null object language, but it is. So we have in other experiments more null objects. It's just a coincidence of the set I picked for this talk. So there's lots of individual variations. Some adults like clitics, some adults like null objects. It just happened that these adults did not like null objects so much, but it exists. When you look at islands, then things get more interesting. So what we see is that the rate of DPs goes up in children, also in adults. But what's crucial is the comparison between clitic and null. And what we see is that children are not much different from what they do in root context. So they also have null objects in this context. And adults here and also in the other results we have, they never do null objects. So they really rule out null objects in this context. So the relevant result for us is that there's massive omission of clitics by children until later ages than what has been reported for other languages. The omission is higher than what has been reported for other languages, and we find it both in root context and in island. Now, the question now is how to interpret this omission in islands. And we could ask two questions. One is that children don't know about islands. So island is something that is acquired late, islandhood. The other option is that children know about islands, they don't know about null objects, and they're overusing null objects, even in a context in which the null object is ruled out. So in order to opt for one of these options, what we did was to actually know whether children know that Portuguese is a null object language. We cannot say that they're overusing null objects if they don't have a null object grammar, and to investigate omission in the context in which omission is ruled out, to actually know whether they are overusing null objects. So very briefly, just telling you the results. We elicited, and our student Carolina elicited the acquisition of first and second person clitics, and also the production of first and second person clitics, and also the production of reflexive clitics. Remember that these are contexts in which null objects are ruled out, even in root contexts. And what she found and what we found was that omission was found in both cases. So even in cases in which null objects are ruled out in root context, kids omit reflexive and first and second person clitics. So what this tells us that omission is not restricted to island context. We find omission in contexts in which islandhood does not play any role. So it may be that islandhood is not the key to explain what children are doing. Then in order to know whether children know that Portuguese is a null object grammar, what we did was to do a truth value judgment test to assess the acceptability of null objects in both contexts, in root context, in island context, and actually also in reflexive context. And the idea, and we basically did reproduced and adapted the test done for French and English. What we did was we first showed the first picture to introduce characters, and then so we had things like, this is Rui, what's the name of the kid, and the dog, and there's a ball, and they're by a swimming pool. Let's see what Rui did to the dog. This was to create the expectation that he did something to the dog. And then we changed the second picture, and the puppet said, look, he dove in the pool. And if you don't have a null object grammar, the only interpretation for this is an intransitive interpretation. So he jumped in the pool, and not he put the dog in the pool. If you have a null object grammar, this sentence is ambiguous in general, and it's true in this context because it's putting the dog in the water. You don't need a clitic to say this. Then we did the same for reflexives. Let's see what the child is going to do to the elephant. And then the puppet said, look, the child is washing. This is bad for this situation for adults, so you need a reflexive clitic there. So we tested whether children accepted this, and we did the same in islands. This is the island context. So let's see what happened. And then we said the dog barked, and we trained children to know that when the dog had an open mouth, it was barking. The dog barked when Louise, the kid, rocked in the chair. Now, this, for an adult, this is bad. The only interpretation for this sentence is that the guy himself is sitting in the chair and rocking, not that he can be rocking the dog in the chair. Of course, we always used verbs that can have either a transitive or an intransitive reading, otherwise the experiment wouldn't work. So the result we got was that children accept null objects. So in the root context, the swimming pool context, they are perfect, they are adult-like in the interpretation, and it's interesting to compare this with the results that Therese Grutter got for French and English. So creating a very similar situation, children reject all the null object, what would be a null object interpretation. They can only assign intransitive readings to a verb without a complement. They are not able to assign transitive readings, even if the context really favors and the image, the picture really favors the transitive interpretation. Now, where children differed from adults was in the island context. So adults rejected the transitive interpretation in island context, but children accepted it. So the rocking chair context was okay for children, but not for adults. So this is target deviant, but it's consistent with production. Remind that in production, they were overusing null object in islands, and now they are over-accepting null object in islands. One relevant thing here is that they also accepted null objects in the reflexive context. So the elephant and the bathtub context, they accepted it with the reflexive interpretation, and adults did not. So again, this indicates that maybe islandhood is not the problem for children, but the over-acceptance of null objects in contexts in which adults don't accept them. Then there's a question that goes beyond what we're doing here, so I'll go through it very quickly. The big question is why then null objects are overused, and in a recent paper we argue that it's not the null object grammar, it's not the island context. What is going on is that children acquire the type of empty category being used late. In order for you to know whether a null object is good or bad, you have to distinguish pro from variables, and we tested the children's sensitivity to strict and sloppy readings in null subject and null object context, and basically the results show that children don't master the difference between these two types of empty, or the properties associated to the two types of empty categories. So it might be that they are using a pro in a null object context where they should have a variable. Now, the conclusions, and we're running out of time. For this European Portuguese data, what we show is that islandhood is not the source of the problem in the acquisition of clitics and in the acquisition of null objects, and perhaps the delay in acquisition has to do with the late acquisition of the semantic properties of the null categories and not to the context where they appear. So if we go back to our questions when we started working on this abstract, actually, the first question was whether children's overuse of enclases in Cypriot Greek and null objects in Portuguese could be thought of as a consequence of a late acquisition of islands, and if so, what would the meaning of this be? What would the meaning of a late acquisition of islands mean? It might be that islands are not the grammatical constraint, but processing, it could have to do with the development of processing capacities, and then acquisition is a very good scenario to look at because we know that some processing capacities are not fully mastered at the beginning. When we looked at the domains in which null objects are overused, and we compared islands with reflexives and first person and second person, what we show is that it's not the islandhood by itself that can be taken as a unifying factor for all these. So in order to acquire null objects, you have to master the distinction between variables and pronouns, and in order to master proclises and enclases, you have to know morphophonological constraints that underlie this variation. Now, we think that the observations we're bringing here are important for two reasons. The first one is that islands are not necessarily difficult. So we may say, well, what we find in islands is actually a side effect of other properties that are at stake for these constructions. And if islands are not necessarily different, then our results have had evidence against the claims that island effects in adults are due to processing issues, because they are okay for children at ages in which there is strong evidence that there are still processing overload issues in dealing with several constructions. So if you look at, I don't know, intervention effects or dealing with stress shift in focus constructions, we know that children sometimes get overwhelmed with processing issues. So for the data we're looking at, we can actually see that islands are not an issue for children, so we can tease apart the two. Then 3 final notes. We can, on the other hand, show that there is some early sensitivity to islandhood, because when we look at the rates of clitic production in islands and rate of clitic production in root context in European Portuguese, we can show that they treat the two contexts differently. So if they are being treated differently, this means that they are sensitive to the island context, and they are not just treating an island context as a root context. So they know that something different is going on. Also, this sensitivity to islandhood varies cross-linguistically, and arguably it depends on the availability of the null object option in the grammar. So we also show very early sensitivity to a construction that is involved or for which islandhood is a critical issue. Finally, when we go back in particular to the Cypriot Greek data, what we have shown is that independent difficulties in specific structures may include factors such as morphophonological properties or the social syntactic kind of effect that Kleanthe has talked about. So in general, the general conclusion is that islands are not a problem.
have a quick data question. Maybe you said it and I missed it at the beginning, but the tests that where the islands were, what kind of islands were there? Were there different kinds?
No, it was always the same. It was always an adverbial clause starting with because.
See, that weakens the claim that you make at the end against the processing account of islands, given that, at least as far as I know, that literature on the processing account of islands assumes a certain typology according to which only certain kinds of islands are due to processing factors. So at least you can only claim that the type of island that you use can be due to processing.
Yeah, sure.
But there might be many other islands that could be due to processing factors.
Yeah. True, but also there's the issue of what is the unifying factor for this, right? And we're setting aside the islandhood as the source of difficulty for all this. But you're right, I mean, then we have to expand this to other types of islands.
Right, but there you've got the added difficulty that if you want to have a negative island, well, we know that in negation we have a different clitic environment, pro-clitic antis environment. Again, if you have a WH island, we know that there we have differences again. So the nice thing about the because, about adjunct islands, is that prima facie, it's the same environments in terms of placement.
Yes?
This is a methodological. That's kind of a methodological question with respect to European Portuguese, because given the fact that European Portuguese has null objects, but also V-stranding VP ellipsis phenomena, and V-stranding VP ellipsis is not sensitive to Iceland.
Yeah.
How do you control that the kit is not doing VP ellipsis and not null objects?
With the verb. So another difference besides islandhood is that VP ellipsis requires verbal parallelism. So what we did to avoid this was to make sure that the verbs were not the same. So this gives us some safety that they are not doing VP ellipsis. And this test now we did with strict and sloppy readings. We actually added a VP ellipsis condition, and that was the condition in which they were best. So again, this is an indirect evidence that where they fail, they are not doing VP ellipsis. I mean, it's very indirect, but it's...
More questions? Yes?
So I'm wondering about the conclusion about, I mean, so islands are not the problem. I mean, if what you could say, I don't know if anybody does say that, but maybe if you're Richie Kane or something, you could say the reason why you sometimes omit stuff is because it moves to the edge, and that's how you get omission. And so islands can be incredibly hard for processing and for movement, but then you expect, you expect like your Cypriot kids to produce those clitics there because they can't get out of the island, and then yeah, maybe they're very hard. Movement out of an island is very hard to process, and kids just won't do that.
Well, then it would be interesting to compare these results with results on movement in general, right? And movement is not problematic for children unless you have intervention effects, right? So I'm thinking of the results for null objects. One might say, well, they mess up with null objects because there's some problems with movement, right? Then what is interesting to look at cases in which you can say that there is movement of empty stuff, right? So we were actually discussing this earlier today. So if you look, for instance, at a comparison between the comprehension and production of headed relatives versus free relatives. Headed relatives are harder than free relatives, which might indicate that moving empty operators is not problematic, right? And then, in these cases, for instance, the overuse of null object, should not be problematic because you'd be moving an empty operator as well. Right? Does this make sense?
Likewise, remember that we're not really looking at getting out of the island, but producing something within the island.
No, but suppose you're Richie Kane and you think that you can omit stuff if it's at the edge. And so in order to omit your clitic, you actually have to get to the causal edge, and that's the explanation for why you can't omit the clitics within the island, because it's an island for movement, so you can never get the clitic out of it to the position where it could be. I'm pulling this out of my sleeve, making it up, but if you really wanted to insist that islands are hard to process, I mean, movement out of islands is hard to process, that would be a consistent story with that line.
Right, just two things. I mean, first of all, what we saw in Portuguese, that the kids do some omission, which, you may have a point there, maybe that's why they do it, because, they who knows, they try to. But I mean, we didn't really go over any error analyses, but what you see for Cypriot Greek, that the overall clitic production was very high. Now, the remaining 10% or so were, so what we had is, unlike other languages, our kids produce very, very few omissions, fair enough. But interestingly enough, they also produce very, very few full DP replacements. So that might be something like, if you are on an island and you want to refer to something outside, outside that island, well, here's your chance to use a tonic pronoun or a full DP, but they didn't do that either. Yeah. So it's as if they didn't really care about that relation.
One last question. We have time. Yes, here.
Microphone is coming.
Yes.
Needed for recordings. Yeah. So we can sue you in case.
You ask a nasty question.
Got the evidence right there.
Okay, so this is just a clarification question, unlikely to sue me.
No sue.
I was just wondering about in the Cypriot Greek experiment. So I was surprised that adults had 100% production, right, in both the overall clitic production and the target clitic placement. So I was just wondering, did you tell them which dialect they should use? I mean, how did they know? I mean, did you, because in theory, that should be an ambiguous question in a way. So I was wondering if the difference is that you told that the adults somehow figured out what you want, whereas the children didn't figure out what you're looking for.
Right, that is a very serious methodological issue anyway. As I guess generally, whenever you look at say bidialectal context. Now, first of all, for the kids, what we did, the experimenter, all experimenters for Cypriot Greek were Cypriot Greek native speakers, and they sat down with the child. Even most of the children were actually tested in the schools, in a private room, and of course you have this social factors. When do you use Standard Modern Greek? When do you use Cypriot Greek? So. The experimenter was an adult, so a respect person, somebody who comes in, it was a stranger. So these are all the right kind of environments where you would expect the child to use Standard Modern Greek anyway. So to counterbalance that a little bit, before we started, the experimenters talked to the child for a couple of minutes in, maybe a little bit overproduced Cypriot Greek, heavy dialect, to put the child at ease, saying, it's a beautiful day out there, what do you think, and what do you like, what's your favorite cartoon, or what did you do over the weekend, just to put the child at ease, talking to the child in Cypriot and expecting some kind of Cypriot back, so that the child knows, okay, this is someone I can talk to in the dialect, I don't have to speak formal, only because I'm in school or something. And then there was 2 warm-up questions too, right, so the child had some idea of getting there. With the adults, we didn't have to do that. Of course, the experimenter taught the adult speak Cypriot. So fair enough. At that age, we figured that the adults are quite aware of doing this or that. Now, the funny thing is, though, that while adults are aware of what Cypriot Greek is and what Standard Modern Greek is, they're not always that aware of what the intricate properties are. So they're not aware of placement, clitic placement as one factor necessarily as such. And that we have other studies going on right now that actually look at how teachers assess the grammar of the pupils, and we find that they do not mark all Cypriot mistakes in their written Greek as such, and they do some overgeneralization. So that's another issue. It's a tricky thing. Now, coming back to your original question, at the beginning we only had 8 adults, and we figured, okay, 8 adults gave us 100% clinics. Production, 100% production is expected. But 100% click placement, enclisis, we figured, okay, so they speak Cypriot. Now, one of my students, or one of my former undergraduate students, who was actually a Greek speaker from Greece, doubted that adults actually give you 100% clinics, simply because she says, being very sensitive to the language around her, that she observed lots of Greek Cypriots speaking Cypriot Greek, but using standard modern Greek critic placement in a number of contexts. So she was the instigator of extending the second study to the binational and Greek children and adults as well. For that, they actually had lots and lots of participants. Also, they had 20 Cypriot Greek adults, 20 binational and 20 Hellenic Greek adult controls. So many, many more. And what they found with the 20 Cypriot Greek and the bilectal speakers is that they did not produce 100% enclisis. So what you said that you would expect that there might be some variation, there was some variation. So they overwhelmingly did enclisis, but a number of them also did some proclisis. What that is and where that comes from is not so clear to us. However, and likewise, I gave the example of the reversal child who gave 100% enclisis in the island context, and when tested without islands, but as a simple declarative, she gave 100% proclisis. So what we're doing next is going to test both adults and children on both tools, that is the full island tool, as we have, and the lighter version, where you only expect a simple declarative answer, to see whether there are some, whether adults systematically do something like that too. So maybe in the other case, we will get 100% enclisis by adults for the simple tool, but not 100%, maybe only around 70, 77% what we got with the extended number of adults, with the 20 adults in the second study for the island tool. That might point to a difference.
Okay, so thank you.
Thank you.